Hi, and welcome to the second week of English Linguistics 317. And this is the second lecture. I hope that you had a chance to view all the videos you were supposed to watch last week. We're just going to kind of wrap up the introduction in this video. So in the last class, we actually looked at a definition of language as a system. And this is kind of, like I mentioned in the last week, we are still in the review of English Linguistics 315. So we're kind of refreshing our memory about some of the things that will be fundamental and foundational to a history of English as we go along this semester. So just to kind of remind you about the definition of language as a system, language is a system of conventional vocal signs by means of which human beings communicate. So again, if you've done Linguistics 151, Nature of Language with me, you know that we talk not just about human language in that class, but we also talk about animal communication and other kinds of things. But in this class, we're only going to focus on human communication and natural language, so to speak. So much of what we're talking about, much of what we're defining right now is true of human communication and human language. And in the last video, I kind of broke down this definition of language into these smaller kind of pieces. And we were kind of looking at each of this in detail. So we kind of talked about language as a system with respect to duality of patterning and language as a system with respect to sign, where we talked about the different components like the morphemes. And I kind of want to start with language as a sign. And again, if you've done Linguistics 151 with me, most of this would be familiar to you from having talked about language as a sign in that class. But also, if you've done English Linguistics 315 recently, this would be familiar to you from the morphology section of things. So when we talk about sign, we are talking about the smaller pieces that language is composed of. So the smallest linguistic sign is the morpheme, and the morpheme can be composed of two different kinds of morphemes. So you can have free morphemes and you can have bound morphemes. Since it's a review class, it'll be good for you to kind of, when I talk about a terminology like the free morpheme, start thinking of a couple of examples of free morphemes, right? Because it will be good for you to, again, like I said, keep your Linguistics 315 material with you as we go along this semester. So we also talked in the towards the end of the last video about allomorphy. So morphemes can be allomorphous. A classic example of this is the English plural morpheme. There are some morphemes that are the base morpheme, so the S in English, right? So it's pronounced as Z, and then they have this morpheme has different allomorphic components. It can be realized as a S depending on the last phonetic sound that it attaches to, or it can appear as is according to the last phonetic sound it attaches to. So you can have cats, you can have bees, and you can have judges or churches. So that's the allomorphy that we're talking about with the plural morpheme. But a sign can also be larger than just a morpheme. So you can have idioms, and idioms are combinations of words that have a particular meaning, which cannot be discerned from the smaller individual parts that this idiom is composed of. So kick the bucket is a classic example of an idiom. When you talk about individual meaning of kicking and the bucket, it does not combine itself to the larger idiomatic meaning, which means to die. So that's why it's called an idiom. It's a combination of words that have a specific meaning associated with it, which cannot be discerned or predicted from the smaller units that it's composed of. And a compound is a word that has two or more bases. So we looked at compounds in great detail in 315. So words like steam engine or blackbird, blueberry, etc. They're compounds that are composed of more than one morpheme. So here are some examples. Kick the bucket, come down with, compounds, railway, greenhouse, etc. And we kind of also talked about in 315 about how you can discern a compound from just a combination of words which has a different stress pattern from compounding. Now let's move on with our definition and go into language as vocal. Now, when we talk about vocal language, we often talk about the speech component of language, but it's also good to remember that language also has a gestural component. So you use your hands, you use your facial expressions, you use other body parts to kind of communicate as well. So we are really talking about the speech component where you're talking about using your vocal cords to produce speech, as opposed to, say, writing. So very often, writing systems have come after speech systems have been developed. So when you look at human language, when you look at the history of human language, you can see that there are a lot of oral communities in linguistics. So there are indigenous languages that only have a speech component and they do not have a writing component. So that is the aspect of language that we're talking about as vocal, because it's very easy to have a speech component but not have a writing kind of component. So writing began only about 5,000 years ago, but speech has existed kind of much longer. And we're going to talk about the history of writing a little bit in next week's video. We don't really focus much on writing because when you talk about writing, English, the spelling consequences is something that we will talk about, but otherwise there hasn't been a script change or anything of that sort. But if you look at the history, and you will be doing an assignment on this as well, you will be asked to look at the writing system of a language other than English, and then you can see that there are other kind of writing scripts and systems that exist in the world. So we're not going to be talking a lot about the history of writing, but when you talk about writing, writing is rather new compared to speech and compared to the origin of language and human speech. And there are languages that exist that have only a spoken language and no written language. And fluency in speech often surpasses fluency in writing for a lot of people when you look at literacy and fluency. Now, the advantages of writing is that it's more permanent than speech. So if you have a written record of something, that is obviously more valuable than hearsay, right? So very often when you are negotiating a job contract, very often people say that, even though they've promised you the job, don't assume that you've got it unless you have it in writing, because a written document is obviously, it's more difficult to destroy than just promising somebody that you have a job. And there's also reduction of speech errors. So a classic example, and a lot of work has happened recently in the phonetics of this. When you say ice cream versus ice cream, I mean, it sounds exactly the same when I say it, but when you see it on the lecture slide, you see that these are actually two different ways of writing it. So one is the ice cream cone or ice cream in a scoop, and then the other one is ice cream, right? So there's a lot of work that's focused on how to understand the difference between these kind of speech errors in phonetics. Now, you can also use a lot of devices in writing that actually signal or disambiguate language. So when you say a pretty hot day versus a pretty hot day, the kind of intonation pattern, obviously I use different intonation as you just heard, but also when you see that comma between the two adjectives pretty and hot, you know that the meaning is very different. It's a pretty and it's a hot day versus it's a pretty hot day. That is, the temperature is really warm. So you can use these kind of spaces and pauses in writing that actually signal meaning. But when I'm talking, when it's just speech without the words, it's very difficult to discern the meaning aspect of language. So that's the use of writing. But obviously, there are also advantages for speech and disadvantages for writing. So when you speak, you can obviously use different stress in different intonations, and that signal differences in meaning. So you can say greenhouse versus greenhouse with different stress patterns, and one is a compound and the other one is just a lexical phrase with two different words. So one is the greenhouse, which has plants in it to be stored over winter, and the other one is a house that is green or painted green, right? And that difference comes about with stress, and we talked a lot about this in 315. There are also rising pitch versus falling pitch. So why did you do it? I didn't hear you the first time you told me. So why did you do it, right? It's kind of like a clarification question. Why did you do it? I mean, you didn't tell me. I mean, you were supposed to tell me. So one is a rising pitch and the other one is a falling pitch. And different uses of this pitch and intonation can change the meaning of the same sentence, for example, especially in English. There are different forms of writing, and again, a lot of these are, it's easy to disambiguate it when you're writing. So homophones that are words pronounced alike, like bear and bear, and homographs, words that are written alike, like B-E-A-R and B-E-A-R, and homonyms that are both homophones and homographs, a word that's either pronounced or spelled like another. These are very, very difficult to kind of disambiguate in speech. And unless you are paying very close attention to the context, it's very difficult to get the meaning aspect of it. So that's a clear advantage to writing, as you can see, because in writing, you can clearly see the meaning, and then you also have all that extra context in the paragraph kind of supporting the use of one word over the other. Language as gesture. So this is a very new and upcoming field of linguistics. A lot of work being done with respect to gestural communication. The two areas that I have talked about here, kinesics, a study of body movements, as well as paralanguage. That's basically all the gestures accompanying language. So what expression do I have on my face, right? That can communicate a lot about whether I'm actually enjoying doing something. So am I laughing? Am I frowning? Am I using my hands to kind of gesture as I talk along? So this is a very, very new area, and it's an area that has got a lot of recognition, especially in the area of teaching English as a second language. And I know a lot of you are interested in TESOL in general. So this is a good area for you to keep in mind, as well as the area of intercultural competence. So basically, if you are interacting with a person who speaks a different language as their first language, what are the aspects of communication that you have to kind of keep in mind? So that's what we talk about as language as a gesture. Language as convention. Now, this is again something we've talked about in 315. The whole idea of a language is that, well, you can have different words and different meanings, and well, there's really nothing that's connecting the sound and the form to the meaning, right? This particular notion of language is called as arbitrariness, right? So language is arbitrary. But at the same time, we talk about language change, and language change, I think, is crucial to this class and this course, because we can talk about three different ways in which language is changed. One is called the syntagmatic change, and the other is the paradigmatic change. And then you obviously have all these world events that are influencing language change. So let's look at syntagmatic change. So syntagmatic change is, in a word, for example, you have sounds that affect the pronunciation of other elements in that word. So sandwich, sometimes you hear people drop the d. So you say sandwich, sandwich. You don't say sandwich, right? Sandwich. And this is because of the acoustic properties of n, which is a nasal, and the w, right, which is a bilabial sound. And so you have all these kind of acoustical properties that are influencing the dropping of the d, which very often is difficult for people to transition to, like from the nasal to the d to the w, right? So it's easier for people to just drop the d and then move on from n to w. Or people often also just make it into a nasal sound, which is the m, which is the labiodental nasal, so m, sandwich, right? So these kind of changes where you have one sound affecting another sound in a word is called a syntagmatic change. But you also have paradigmatic change, where it's not about the specific sound, but it's about influences and meaning. So for example, the side of the ship which got loaded on was called laidboard, and the opposite of starboard. And laidboard was then later, it was called as larboard, just because of association with starboard. So laidboard versus larboard and starboard, right? Larboard, the side of the ship that got loaded, right, as opposed to starboard. And then larboard is later on, when you look at the history of the word, it became replaced by port. So now you dock the ship and then you load things onto the ship at a port, right? But this kind of change is called as a paradigmatic change, when there is word associations influenced by meaning and not by the sound or the phonetics of the word. When you also talk about social changes, we often talk about new technologies that have come into being. So we can very often talk about internet, World Wide Web, Google, Wikipedia, etc. All these new technologies that have contributed to changes in pronunciation and changes in the usage of words. So this is one of the biggest change that has happened, I want to say, in the last, say, 30, 40 years or so. So it's still brand new. Not a lot of textbooks still talk about it, but we will be talking about this towards the end of this class. We will have a lecture on how to talk about new changes that are coming up. And we also have social changes. So when you look at the history of a language, it's very often tied into the history of the society that it was, kind of invented in. So very often when you talk about history of English, you talk about purist traditions of English. So when you look at England and the use of English in England, it was a very kind of pure language. But now, obviously, people have different notions about language. It's changed. But also in the 18th, 19th century, when English first came into the United States with colonization, that was the time when British people actually thought that the English spoken in America was actually a non-pure form of the language, just because the accent was different and there were different, words for things and different stress and all that kind of thing. But obviously now things have changed. So we will be talking about the notions of standardization. Do we need standard language? What is standard language? Is standard language what we should be teaching our students in middle schools, right? That is something that we will be talking about quite a bit, because when we talk about the history of English, it's very easy to kind of talk about where these ideas of standardization has come from, right? And where are we going with this? Is the new texting language corrupting language, right? These are questions that we can ask, and these are questions that we can debate. So that's something that I'm going to be focusing quite a bit on as we get into Middle English and early modern English. So English has changed over the years. So this is kind of what we are going to be looking at. Throughout the rest of this course, we're going to be starting with Old English, which is roughly around 450 AD to 500 AD, right up to 1100 AD, or the Norman conquest is kind of what signals the start of the Middle English era, 1100 to 1500 AD, and Modern English from 1500 AD. And I'm pretty sure that we are in a new era of English, but we are in it as it is happening, so we don't have a name for it yet. We can call it Internet English or Revolutionary English or Text English or whatever name you want to call it, but I'm pretty sure that we are in a different era of English as we speak. But again, like I said, it's probably only our grandchildren who will be learning about this era in their textbooks in History of English course. History of English still remains as a course 100 years from now. Synchrony versus diachrony. So when we talk about language change, we can often talk about diachronic change versus synchronic changes. So a diachronic change is historical changes that have happened. So across time, you can talk about different changes that have happened pertaining to phonetics and phonology, meaning-related points, etc. And then you also have synchronic changes. And two terminology here that will be relevant and that should be familiar to you by now are dialects and registers. So a dialect is a variety of language associated with a particular place, social level, ethnic group, sex, or age. So you can have the Southern dialect, like the Louisiana version, versus the Minnesota dialect, where people often talk about Minnesota, right? Like the kind of different pronunciation patterns that they have. And register is basically the use of language for a particular purpose. So you can have academic register versus Facebook posts, for example. So that's a kind of difference in register. You can also talk about acceptability. So in linguistics, we often talk about, is a particular construction acceptable to the speakers who speak that language? And this kind of ties in with standardization and notions of purity that I just mentioned, and we will be talking about in great deal with the coming kind of weeks. So do we need an absolute standard for a language, whether it's English or whether it's any other language? And what can we do? I mean, this is something that I think is quite relevant to English, given English's history and English's language change. But I also want you to think about it and reflect about it, as many of you are going to become teachers in school districts in Wichita and Greater Wichita. What are the kind of standardized versions of English we are teaching our students? And is it a requirement? Is it an absolute requirement to teach those standards? Or is it okay to accept dialects and registers and talk about it and make it a part of the regular curriculum of middle school English? Something that we will be talking about greatly in this class, but also something I want you to reflect on from your personal experience. Language as a human. And so this is something that I'm not going to talk a great deal about. There's a lot of theories out there as to the origin of human language. There's the poo-poo theory, the bow-bow theory, and the theory of innateness. And poo-poo theory and bow-bow theory have to do with the fact that many children start imitating animals, and many children actually start with these kind of babbles, of da da da, ba ba ba, pa pa pa, kind of sound systems, and maybe that's the origin of language. But there's also the theory of innateness, which is given by Noam Chomsky, who's a linguist and a philosopher, that we actually come with a language box inside our head, and this language kind of acquisition device, LAD, helps us learn language, whether it's English or French or German or any other language for that matter. But I'm not going to be talking a great deal about this. I just want you to know that there are all these different theories out there. They will remain theories because they can neither be proven nor disproved, because we don't have somebody who spoke language for the first time to ask them. Maybe we could ask a baby, I guess, but you're not going to get an answer from a baby. So I just want you to know that there are all these kind of theories out there. So I'm going to wrap up with the last aspect of language as communication. And so this is a topic, I think, which is dealt with outside of linguistics mostly, like when you talk about language as communication science or journalism and that kind of thing. A question that's very often asked in this is whether language influences the way we think. There's a very good answer to this from the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Anthropologists who are taking this class would be more familiar with this. And the answer seems to be yes, that depending on the language we speak, there are differences in the way that we experience language. And again, this is a very controversial topic. I'm not going to be getting into this in any greater detail. You can Google Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and read up more about this. There's a lot of work that still happens within this tradition. But again, like I said, it's a controversial topic, so we're not going to really talk more about that. There are also other characteristics of language, such as language as an open system. What do I mean by that? Language is welcoming of new words and is welcoming of new constructions and new changes. And it's an open system in that it's not a closed system. There is scope for change, and language changes every single day as we speak. And it also displays displacement. So very often in language, you can actually talk about things that have happened in the past and things that are going to happen in our future. So there is that aspect of displacement in language. So why are we interested in studying the history of English, right? I mean, why English, I guess? English is one of those kind of languages that has a long history of change and a long history of kind of political movements and social movements that have shaped the history and the language itself. And so that's the reason why we are interested in studying the history of English, because through studying English and the history of English, we can understand ourselves better, right? And we can also understand current linguistic trends and understand how they kind of developed across time. And it also will help us understand literature better and kind of understand sound consequences. So language consequences in a historical piece or a literature piece that you're reading, for example. So English has quite a dominant role in the world. But if you look at the number of speakers, for example, there are 497 million speakers of English. But if you look at Mandarin, for example, there are 1,025 million speakers of Mandarin, but they're all kind of located in one area of the world. But when you talk about the 497 million speakers of English, they're kind of scattered all across the globe. So there's a lot of different factors for the dominant role of English. We're going to talk about economic and technological factors. We're going to talk about how English became the lingua franca of the world. And how there are a lot of artificial international languages as well that kind of helped the growth of English, because they kind of did not take off. And a lot of these languages have English as kind of like a base language. Here are some features of English. It's a Germanic language. Over half of English's words have come from Latin. There's a lot of capacity for assimilation, adaptability and flexibility in English, which has also resulted in the loss of grammatical gender, relatively ease of learning. There's also mixed vocabulary because English is borrowed from a lot of different languages, such as Native American languages, Dutch, Italian, Spanish, Persian, etc., to kind of just give you a small subset of the languages that English is borrowed from. We will be talking a great deal about this as we go along in the semester. And there are also some historical factors that are causing these changes. I'm kind of giving you a broad overview of the rest of the class, actually, the rest of the course, actually. We will talk about Christian traditions and how the church influenced English. The Scandinavian conquest, the Norman conquest, 100 Years' War, Renaissance, colonial expansion, imperialism, and industrialization, to kind of give you a subset of the historical factors causing changes in English. All right, so the next class, well, we'll actually not be reviewing IPA. I want you to actually do that on your own, kind of go over and review IPA. We'll actually be talking about the history of writing in the next class, and also a little bit of corpus linguistics in the next week. I obviously want you to review IPA and kind of keep your IPA chart as we go along this semester. So that is all for this week. I will see you in next week's video.